Welcome to Om Times TV, a division of Om Times Media and Broadcasting. Welcome to What is Going Om, for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on Om Times' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandy Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello. From the Americas to Europe and from India to China, dragons have captivated human imagination for centuries. Believed by many cultures to have been real for centuries, dragons have become a staple in folklore, fairy tales, and fantasy literature due to their deep mythological roots, their evolution through literary history, and their symbolic significance. But of course, most people don't believe that these magical beings really exist. Anie Williams is a composer, harpist, singer of cross-cultural sacred music, and a pioneer in sound medicine. Best known for her music recordings, which have been distributed worldwide for decades, Anie Williams joins me today to discuss her first non-fiction book, Guardians of the Dragon Path, Ancient Temples of the Pyrenees, The Way of the Stars, Camino, and Magdalena, which chronicles a remarkable journey that resulted in the groundbreaking discovery of the titular Dragon Path, proving that truth is indeed stranger than fiction. Anie Williams, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for inviting me.
I have to thank you for writing such a treasure trove of a book. Honestly, this book would probably take half a dozen, if not more, interviews to even begin to, scratch the surface of it. The amount of research you've done, how long did it take you?
Almost 18 years. I mean, I was researching in the landscape for that long, but the actual writing was more like 5 or 6 years, and then packing in all of the historical evidence that backed up what I was discovering was more intensive for 3 years.
Wow. And this is just the first of a trilogy. Yeah, talk about a life's work, an opus for sure. You were born in Los Angeles,
right?
Into the lineage of respected poets and authors. You've traveled the world extensively. What were you like growing up? Were you always interested in music? Did you have an interest in this kind of history?
Interestingly, my family was very interested in music, and my grandfather was a German opera singer. And our family always sang on vacations, and my father played the piano, so he started teaching me a bit when I was about 5. So I started my serious music not until much later, but history, I actually hated history in school because I didn't like the way they were teaching it or the particular subject matter, but I have a tremendous amount of bloodline of history writers. My great-great-uncle, my great-grandmother wrote reams of books on ancient history and natural history. So kind of was a destiny.
So when did your interest in France, in, all of this ancient history there, what prompted that?
Well, about 19 years ago, I moved to France. And for the first few years, I was part-time, and then I got my residency. And as soon as I landed, I had really good friends that knew the sites and the history of the area. So they started showing me different places. In the region where I am now is in the southwestern part of France, near the Mediterranean and near the Pyrenees, which divide France and Spain today. So then I got very, very interested in the Spanish history, the history of the Iberian Peninsula. And since the village where I'm living is right on the Paris Meridian, I started getting very interested in sites that are located on the meridian. And it seems as though It was recognized as a meridian long before it was measured by 17th century Parisian scientists from the Paris Observatory. And one of my dear friends was the late Henry Lincoln. And he said something on the order of that the meridian is a cromlech intersect point, which means cromlech is a stone circle. So we have finding lots of megalithic, Neolithic stone structures, sanctuaries right on the meridian. So Henry gave me the first clue, really.
I read his books back in the 90s. Yeah, yeah. So your book has been described as a masterwork of the legends, history, and spirituality which flourished in the Pyrenees and Catalonia. What I want to know is, this particular person who wrote this also said something about the magical landscape that is finally being understood. What is being understood? What are you?
Good question. There are so many layers. One of the first things I noticed about France in general, but especially in the southern part, the closer to the Pyrenees, I experienced a depth of history. I felt the layers, layer upon layer throughout time. And right near where I am in the south of France, near the Pyrenees, is a site called Tottevel, where they discovered a skull of a human 450,000 years old. So, we're going back layers and layers. And then I discovered some of the magical things about Pyrenean legends. And you spoke about dragons. Of course, it's part of the title. And the Pyrenean people, especially the Basque people, and they have believed in dragons forever. And they believe that dragons actually live maybe from an unseen realm within the mountains themselves and actually created the Pyrenees. That's one story. But they're in charge of weather. They're in charge of these great storms that crash down So many cultures actually believe that dragons are overseers of the elemental realms. So that really fits together where legend and different cultural beliefs come together.
There's something about dragons that really attracts I love dragons. And yes, I believe they're real. Not here necessarily, but somewhere. They're just the most amazing creatures. You couldn't invent something like a dragon, I don't think, although lots of people say they've just come from our imagination. But I really don't think that's true. How do the dragons, why is it called a dragon path?
Yeah, well, going back to dragons, I think, it's part of our memory, deep memory, because dinosaurs certainly, especially the winged ones, really are kind of our dragons, so they actually existed. And in the valley around the Paris Meridian where I live, they found dragon eggs, dragon bones. There's a whole dragon, let's correct that. Dinosaur bones, dinosaur eggs, and there's a dinosaur museum nearby. So in a way, they kind of morph in my consciousness a bit. But the idea of the dragon path, so I became very interested in the Paris Meridian because when the scientists were measuring it, they discovered many things. They discovered that just measuring the meridian by using fixed stars, mostly the sun, they could figure out the speed of light, the speed of sound, and the properties of gravity. And I found that just extraordinary.
So why did they call it the Paris Meridian? And how did they know this meridian was there?
Well, there are meridians everywhere. Meridian is simply a line. If you take a globe, a model of the Earth, or you draw a line between the North Pole and the South Pole, you have a meridian. But the purpose for finding specific meridians in specific places, for instance, the King of France in 1650 or so commissioned all these scientists to establish the Paris Observatory, because the culture or the country who knows longitude rules. They rule trade because they can navigate on land and sea. And now, of course, we use it for flights as well. But in those days, navigating by land and sea, establishing dominance in the trade realm, you were the dominant country. So, of course, every country wanted to have that meridian in their country. And later there ensued the battle with Greenwich, with England, and Greenwich won. So, but still, it's interesting because when I started looking at the Paris Meridian and where they measured it to, it ends at the island of Minorca at a place called Isla Dragonera, or the island of small dragonesses. And I thought, wow, how romantic. And then, I call the Mediterranean Aphrodite's pond because Aphrodite was born out of the Mediterranean foamy seawater. So there's a lot of legendary, a lot of mythology woven in, but also a lot of science to give it a ground. So in researching the Paris Meridian, I discovered many groupings of megalithic sites, not just one little standing stone, but groups of dozens centered around the Paris Meridian. So that got me off and running in my research.
So they must have been areas of a special kind of energy for those, So would you say that the meridians are like ley lines? Because we hear about dragon lines.
Not necessarily. I mean, okay, dragon lines are ley lines, more or less. I mean, they were called lung mei in China, and they were alignments of energy and the focused energy flows, terrestrial flows that are also influenced by the celestial. And in the dragon line or the Paris Meridian, when it gets close to the Pyrenees, it actually interacts with the Eurasian and the Iberian tectonic plates where they came together and pushed up the mountain range. So we have a lot of electromagnetic anomalies, discontinuities of energy where ancient people, when they felt those places, felt, here's a place where I feel elevated. Here's a place where I can connect with the ancestors or the spirits of the land and life. So they built their sites along these energy lines. And I don't know if you know Rory Duff's work, but he's a retired geological engineer. He's English, he's written books, and he's done a lot of research on dragon lines. He says a lot of them run through Spain, which I found very interesting because there's a tremendous amount of geological activity there and also a lot of megalithic sites.
Mm. So the dragon path, how far does it go?
Well, it was measured. I don't know if you want to bring up that image one, but it shows it was measured from the northern extreme of land in France at Dunkirk on the North Sea there. And it was right through Paris, right through the Pyrenees, and then it was continued near Barcelona to Majorca. So it's pretty long.
So have you traveled the whole length of it?
Only part. I haven't traveled the northernmost part above Paris, north of Paris. But there's an interesting book. I'm not sure I will remember his name. He wrote a book on the Mediolanum, Middle Earth. And he discovered that the site at Dunkirk was actually an island long ago during the time that the Celts, around 600, 300, 200 BC, and then into AD. They had an island there called Lugundum, or named after Lug, the sun god. And so it was a solar temple at the very northern end of the meridian. And at the southern, of course, it's named for so I've explored from Paris right down through the center of France. I just made a 8-day research excursion to the center, which is called Mediolanum, or Middle Earth. And it's interesting because all this realm of magic and dragons and the Lord of the Rings, they talk about Middle Earth. They got their ideas a lot of times from ancient mythology and history. The Celtic.
Yeah, they do. So tell me about the ancient way of the stars. Is this a pilgrimage route?
Yes. Oh, that's fascinating. So once I had been working with the North-South Meridian, which I call the Dragon Line, and all the different megalithic sites, and actually Magdalen, Mary Magdalene sites and Templar sites that are located right on the meridian, I researched the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. And I met people in Catalonia who were researchers and talked about the way of the stars. And I thought, well, that's what the Camino, it is named for. Compostela is field of stars. So it was named for this way of the stars. But the way of the stars actually started perhaps 6,000 years ago. There's a wonderful German astrophysicist that I quote in my book. Gosh, I'm not remembering his name right now, but he wrote about the ancient star paths. And the one I wrote about that goes across northern Spain, which later became the Camino de Santiago, the way of the stars starts at the eastern end of the Pyrenees. And it goes right across the southern base of the Pyrenees and is marked by megalithic sites over and over and over, and Magdalen churches from the medieval era. So it's interesting, layer upon layer throughout history. People sensed the importance of this energy, of this. Now this runs right along the fault line. So there was that draw for people that was a special place energetically. Also, the minerals in the land. Paul Devereaux, a countryman of yours, author, did a lot of research with the Dragon Project and discovered that the minerals in the earth, the geological formations, have a lot to do with the energetics and things like earth lights. So the tremendous amount of salt, iron, copper, gold, silver that we find along the Pyrenees creates a lot of these energies as well. So this, to back up, the way of the stars ran from the end of the Pyrenees at the Mediterranean, the easternmost point of Spain, right along the southern base of the Pyrenees, all the way to Finisterre, which is the current end of the Santiago path.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because we find these sites established 6,000 years ago, and perhaps earlier, because there are, what the term transhumance is? It's that moving of herds across the land, moving of people in herds. And so these transhumance paths moved along the same path of the way of the stars. And so these paths were traveled, we know for sure, 17,000 years. There's a lot of archaeological research in this. So it's a path that goes back in time and is still used today by modern pilgrims as an initiation path. And there's a connection with so many things that we could talk about forever. The gene keys, for instance, the 64 codons of DNA. There are 64 stages in the Camino. 64, it just goes on and on. It's
What is it about that number, do you think?
64 is so interesting. I discovered 64, of course, in the I Ching, but then in the chessboard and in the design and layout of the enigmatic mystery village of Rennes-le-Chateau. The late 19th century priest, Berenger Saunier, laid out a lot of his village when he renovated with 64 coatings. So 64 tiles in the Tor Magdala, the Tower of Magdalen, which was his library. 64 segments in the garden where that tower is placed. It just goes on and on. Cycles of Venus that the Babylonians and the Mayans were tracing. Cycles of Venus, 8 times 8. And this was a very important cycle for humanity and for those who studied the stars and how it worked with the rhythms of the earth. So actually the Camino can be related to these 64 patterns of Venus.
Well, since you brought up Rennes-le-Chateau and Saunière and the Magdalene, let's have a little chat about that, because there's quite a mystery there. I think I just read about it in Lincoln's book about Berenger Saunière, and he was just a priest, a poor priest, and he is rumoured, I mean, they say a lot of this has been debunked now. I don't know about that, but the rumour is that he found something that made him very rich, and people think it had something to do with, buried treasure from, the Templars or something. What do you know about that?
It's so deep. It just goes on, the mystery. And a lot of that is going in book 2. So Saunière was very, very smart. And the priest of the village where I am, they're both called Rennes-le-Chateau and Rennes-le-Bain. The priest of this village, Henri Baudet, and Berenger Saunière were very close friends. They worked in concert. They were both very smart and savvy within the ancient mysteries. And Baudet wrote about it in a very coded book. And I quote him in my book because he talks about the 64 things. Actually, the 64 is coded in one of the parchments that were purportedly found by Saunière, perhaps written later, but regardless, as Henry Lincoln always said to me, they contain information that has validity. So whether it was a hoax or it was written back then or written in the 1960s, it doesn't even matter because there is so much mystery encoded, and the 64 is encoded in the Serpent Rouge, the red serpent document that came out of that bunch of parchments and information from the church. So that probably was constructed much later, but it has a lot of the clues. So the 64, I discovered when I found out that there were 64 churches dedicated to Mary Magdalene in Catalonia alone, which is a little section in northeast Spain. I thought, okay, there's something going on here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you talked about a Baudet, and apparently he and 2 of his fellow priests died in strange circumstances.
Exactly. There were 3 of them. So it's a triangle of villages here. So Saunière had a lot of mystery around his death. Many believe he was poisoned, maybe by digitalis. Baudet died by mysterious suddenly. Now, he had cancer, apparently, but there are indications that it was strange. There was strangeness around it. Also, both priests were questioned by the bishop and, for their eccentric ways. And the 3rd priest in the Trinity was Gelis of the village of Custosa. And it forms a little local triangle. And everyone knows he was murdered. I mean, it's in the documentation. So they had a lot of power, they had a lot of knowledge, and Saunière was working. He was actively communicating with the Habsburgs, who were in power in the whole region. A lot of chateaus, fortifications constructed by the Habsburgs over the centuries. They ruled this part of the Mediterranean, basically. So he was in cahoots with them, maybe with money.
Wow. It's interesting, isn't it? Do any of these old documents, still exist?
Yeah. Henry wrote about several of them in great detail. One of his books is called The Holy Place, and another is Key to the sacred pattern. And in those two books, he writes extensively on the mainly two parchments that were discovered. And one thing that I quote Henry in my first book, well, a lot actually. We were quite close before he passed away in 2022. In one of the parchments, I think it's parchment 2, it talks about Alpha and Omega, panis sal, or bread and salt. Now, Yeshua, Jesus, often talked about being the Alpha and the Omega, but the feminine also spoke about that in the Thunder Perfect Mind of the Nag Hammadi texts. The Thunder Perfect Mind speaks about, I am the first and the last, the Alpha and Omega, and it's she that is speaking. So whether it's Sophia, Mary Magdalene, Mother Mary, the first and the last, so the Alpha, of course, relates to the male, the Omega is the female. And in this parchment, Henry explained to me the way the parchment was laid out in the words. It said, Alpha, bread, Omega, salt. She is the salt, Sophia. It's even in the Gospel of Philip. Salt is Sophia, salt is wisdom. So the Corpus Christi, the body of Christ, is the bread. So it just, all of those things just fit together. So it's Jesus and Mary Magdalene woven into this parchment.
Salt was once the most, it was currency, wasn't it? The Romans used to pay.
Oh, absolutely.
It was so valuable.
Well, salt is so many things. It's used in alchemy. It's one of the 3 prima materia. Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and my guest today is composer, harpist, singer of cross-cultural sacred music, and a pioneer in sound medicine, Anie Williams. And we're talking about her first non-fiction book, Guardians of the Dragon Path, Ancient Temples of the Pyrenees. Still to come, Magdalene Mysteries, Earth Energy, Sacred Sites, Ancient Goddess Culture, the Divine Feminine, and as much as we can pack in. Stay tuned.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of Times flagship radio show, What Is Going On? And as an author, editor, and 13 times book judge who's read thousands of books and interviewed hundreds of authors, I'm constantly asked, what's really worth reading and what's not? So I created the No BS Spiritual Book Club to help you save time and money by picking the brains of discerning names who have walked this path before you. There's no catch, no fees, and no BS. Just an ever-growing library of 10 best spiritual book lists from some of your favourite authors and teachers, plus free book excerpts, audios and video interviews with people like Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., David G., Lee Harris, Mark Nepo and more. From well-known classics to hidden gems you've never heard of, it's the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to enlighten your journey of self-discovery. So why not join the club? Get inspired and save money at the nobsspiritualbookclub.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene Keys is basically the code book of life. In the Gene Keys, the book is made up of these 3 levels: shadows, gifts, and siddhis. And the journey is through those 3 levels. kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the Siddhi. And the Siddhis are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Anie Williams. To add some synchronicity to this wonderful story, you've been having recurring dreams for many, many years. Tell us a little bit about how they play into this story.
Right. So I was quite reticent to mention my dream world because there's so much new age stuff channeling everywhere. And I thought, I want to keep this believable. But I couldn't help but reveal that it was dreams that guided me to do the quest. First dream happened, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. A voice spoke in my dream and said, you need to light 4 fires. And I saw the range of mountains, but I wasn't told where to light the sacred fires. Lighting a fire in the way of making a sacred moment of connection with a site. So there I was, this whole area where I was exploring on both sides of the Pyrenees. And I was first drawn to a site, which is a dolmen called Creu de Coberteia, or the covered cross. And a dolmen is simply a stone house. And it is the largest dolmen. So it's shaped like this. And usually they're oriented to particular parts of the heavens. And this one is right on the eastern end of the Pyrenees, right on the Cap de Creus, the Cape of the Cross. So it's the covered cross dolmen on the Cape of the Cross. And it became the first place where I lit the fire, number 1. And then I discovered it was aligned to the constellation Draco when it was created in about 3500 BC. So we have the dragon theme coming in. And it's right on the eastern end of the Camino, the Way of the Stars. I believe it would have been a natural departure point for the ancient people. Mm-hmm. As they moved between stone sanctuary to sacred mountain, doing their rituals, connecting with earth and spirit, making their way across. So that was number 1. And then I had other dreams that told me that there was a great cross established eons ago. Somehow I was part of this galactic team that established this energetic cross in the earth to create stability energetically and benevolent energy, as a region of coherence reaching across the Pyrenees for future people migrating to the area. So then other dreams guided me to the other point on the western end of the cross. So I ended up finding megalithic settlements, or dozens of megalithic sites marking all points of the cross, all 4 points. So there were 4 fires, and at each point there were megalithic sites galore, often marked with equal armed crosses. So the Great Cross is equal armed. It stretches east-west across the base of the Pyrenees, the old Way of the Stars, the modern Camino, and the north-south dragon line meridian forms the spine.
You also, I mean, you've given us a picture, which we'll show in a minute, about the dolmen in Minorca. What was special about that one?
Well, I wanted to research Mallorca and Minorca because of its situation at the southern end of the meridian, the Paris Meridian, the dragon line. And I discovered a lot of sites called dragons in the area. Dragon caves, dragon coves, and then, of course, the Dragon Island. And Minorca, it has a lot of geological abnormalities that attracted ancient people. It has over 1,000 megalithic sites, stone structures, sacred structures. The most unusual of those are the T-shaped stone pillars that are exactly like the ones at Göbekli Tepe and Karhan Tepe in Turkey. So I started researching these taulas, they're called, which is just a Catalan word for table. We don't know what the ancient people called them, but they were ceremonial sites and they had alignments to the stars. So at all these places I was discovering, there were alignments to either the northern stars or the southern stars or solstice points, and sometimes all three things in one site.
You know, going back to one of the guy, what was his name that you mentioned?
Henry Lincoln?
No, the other guy.
Boudet?
Yes, Boudet. I made a note about something there that said that there was something to do with the zodiac pattern of 13 signs.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. So part of the Priory of Sion mysteries and the parchment mysteries, see a zodiac in the landscape in Boudet's cromlech. So he saw the natural formations of rock structures, which, I mean, I could send you images of, they look like huge menhirs, 25 feet tall, but they're natural in the landscape. Plus there were humanly made menhirs placed as well. But his cromlech was mostly made up of these natural menhirs, circling the area of Rennes-le-Chateau, which is the eastern end is on the meridian, and a salt river, speaking of salt being sacred, running right through. And it wasn't actually Boudet who spoke about the zodiac. He was speaking about the cromlech, but the cromlech becomes understood as a zodiac according to some of the Priory of Sion beliefs. And the story is that the Templars, well, we know the Templars were in the region. They were at each end of this valley. They were in Rennes-le-Chateau. They were in Blanchefort, which is at the entrance to the valley. And they were up on Bézieux, over closer to the south. The Templars were here. We know that. And they were bringing back things from the Holy Land. We know they were excavating at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, underneath Solomon's Temple, etc. So there are a lot of symbols in the region that are carved and, stories and legends about the Templars bringing treasure here. There are stories about the Visigoths when they sacked Rome, bringing that treasure to this area, to Toulouse, which is right near us. The Visigoths were here as well. I mean, we could go way back into treasure stuff, but the idea of the zodiac is really in this circle of the stones of this valley.
Is there a belief that there is still treasure to be found?
Yeah, so over the years, Rennes-le-Chateau has been a red herring for treasure seekers. They're always coming and digging. I mean, we have so many tunnels under Rennes-le-Chateau, and some of them are ancient, escape routes, and some of them are cisterns, and some of them are more modern diggers. But the whole idea of treasure is really, I think, a red herring for the treasure of the heart and the treasure of discovery, being on the quest of the spirit. So for me, that's what this place is. It's a quest of discovery of how the earth and ourselves are working together. The elements in our bodies and the elements in the earth are communicating. the stones and us. And, I think we're coming back to what we once knew, what the ancient people knew.
So, and of course, that whole area is very connected to the Magdalene. Tell me what you know about that, because this is just it's a huge topic. It's hard to know what to pick out of your book to talk about, but, people are always visiting, wanting to tread where they feel she trod.
Right. And I tend to like to go to places where people haven't been trekking very much. And so I didn't really talk too much about Rennes-le-Chateau in my first book because so many other people are, and the other Magdalene sites in southern France. I found more sites dedicated to Mary Magdalene actually in Catalonia and across northern Spain. So 64 of her sites, not only right around the Paris Meridian, but going across the other way as well. And I map all of them out on the maps in my book, and talk about a lot of what they were marking. Some of the sites were surrounded by Templar sites. One of the Magdalene sites that's really primary on the ancient way of the stars was forming, along with the Templar sites surrounding her site in the center, a six-pointed star or a seal of Solomon. So going right through right down to Minorca, Magdalene sites, all the way up the Meridian, across the Pyrenees, Magdalene sites. The most well-known, of course, Rennes-le-Chateau, but it's not right on the Meridian, it's just to the west. But we have Magdalene sites to the north of us. There's a site right on the Meridian called Belcastel in the Aveyron district, so maybe 3 hours drive north of here. A Magdalene chapel established in the 9th century and a castle constructed right around it, right on the Meridian. It's just right there. And then we go north and we find them, of course, around Paris. I think one of the most interesting things is the amount of Magdalene sites, not only in Catalonia on the eastern end of the Camino, but on the western end, in northwestern Spain. I found at least 94 Magdalene churches, chapels, and even peninsulas named for her. Some of the villages still carry on her traditions, and every year they have huge celebrations in her honor. So she's, people don't hear about a site called Anie on the Galician coastline, but she's honored there at least as much as she is in France.
Is there any evidence at all that she actually lived in France after the crucifixion?
Well, so many legends, and just legend upon legend, and some of the earliest Christian writers, churchmen writing about her presence in France. Mainly legends, though. But we have a tremendous amount of sites named for her and legends of her coming not only to Provence, which is the more well-known site around Marseille and Saint-Marie-de-la-Mer and Saint-Maximin, Saint-Baume, but we also have legends of her coming into Aquitaine, borders on the Pyrenees and the Atlantic. So in my first book, I theorize, and I have a map of that Galician coast and the Bay of Biscay, where I theorize that she very well could have traveled along the river, the Garonne River, and traveled through that sea coast, where so many sites are named for her. Much more than in France. It's extraordinary. And so I believe that she came there, but there's no absolute proof.
You were having many dreams. You'd been having dreams for 2 or 3 decades.
No, my whole life.
You had some dreams about the Egyptian Palermo stone.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think I call that chapter Black Stone Calling. I had a repeating dream. If we have a repeating dream, it usually means something in our own psychology and our psyche that we need to pay attention to, or something that we're about to discover. And in my case, I mean, I always grow from what I discover, but it was part of the quest. And I kept dreaming about visiting an old monastery that became a museum and being shown a black stone. Oh, I can't remember the dimensions, maybe 5 feet by 3 feet, and inscribed with Egyptian hieroglyphs. And in the dream, I was told 2 words, Kaaba. Kaaba, the Kaaba stone of Mecca, or the Kaaba of the bodies that are the etheric travelers. I mean, what was it? So it was a grand adventure that led me to the Palermo stone in Palermo, Sicily, in the museum there that is actually from Egypt. It's one of the main pieces of the old stone. That was the first inscribed mention of the Kaaba opening of the mouth ritual that was done with the pharaoh for the afterlife journey. The journey just goes on, and ultimately it led me to the center of the Great Cross, a little tiny chapel in the middle of the Pyrenees that I had never heard of. I've never heard of anyone talk about it. And it happened to have a painting over the altar of Magdalena's Kaaba rising out of her body, and Yeshua, Jesus, catching her etheric body. And that's a really unusual painting. You just don't see that. You don't usually see her on her deathbed, and especially you don't see her with her second body, etheric body, emanating out of her mouth. So it all just started falling together. So it's a grand adventure.
It's a great adventure. I love that you mentioned the antiquity mechanism, because the first time I heard about that, I felt such a pull towards it. And it's just absolutely fascinated me. And of course, they now believe this was some kind of, early computer kind of thing, very much connected to navigating by the stars.
Exactly. And there were gears and wheels that were for the planets, the stars. And so for navigators across the Mediterranean, this was a great tool. And it was discovered right near the Isle of Rhodes. And the Isle of Rhodes was one of the greatest centers of Hermetic academies, the Ophite schools of healing. Ophite from the serpent, the old word for serpent, Greek.
There's the dragon again.
Absolutely. The serpents and dragons are fairly interchangeable in ancient mythology and traditions. One of the important things to mention is the Isle of Rhodes. The people of Rhodes came and established their temples and their traditions in Iberia or Spain along the Mediterranean. So we have those traditions of healing. The serpent was related to wisdom, healing, medicine. All the great healers, Asclepius, Hygeia, they all had their serpents, Hermes, etc. So they brought all of these traditions, and a lot of the sites in Iberia were named Ophiusa, which is a clue that those Ophite traditions came and established their schools and traditions and temples there.
Yeah, the synchronicities just go on and on and on. One of them that made me smile was you wrote about, I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but this priest and scholar Ficino.
The what?
Ficino, a chap called Ficino, who was a priest and
Ficino. Yes, Marsilio Ficino.
Yes, and he did exactly what you're doing.
Yes, I love Ficino. I love his work was so pioneering. So he was working under Cosimo Medici in Florence, Italy. He was in charge of the Neoplatonic Academy there. And he was a churchman, but he was also a scholar and into astronomy, astrology, and medicine. And he he was the first to translate the Hermetic traditions, the Corpus Hermeticum, into Latin. So it brought all of those, again, much later in the 1500s or 1400s, the Hermetic body of knowledge into Europe that had come much earlier as well. But he's doing, like you say, along with the Pythagoreans, doing what I'm doing with the sound medicine, working with the star patterns, the sounds, the harp. Yeah.
Were you surprised when you came across that?
All kinds of bells and whistles went off. How that feels when you find something. Yes. Yeah.
So tell us, I mean, you've been creating all kinds of music on this journey, music at, different places. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So during the quests, when I go to an ancient site, if I don't have my harp, I at least sing at the site. So I listen. I listen to the site. I ask for dominant tones that might put one in connection with that site and its purpose, its energies. So I'm an intuitive, so I listen, I hear things, I hear melodies, I hear tones. And so these became songs of the sites, and I ended up calling it a Camino de Canciones, or a path of songs, because everywhere I was going, I was bringing a very small harp and my voice normally, sometimes a little dragon flute, like an ocarina that I play. And there was always some sort of music at each site, and a lot of them became songs. There are many, many more that never really materialized, but, were just for the moment. But this path of songs, I couldn't just write a 400-page book, right? I had to create a double music album. And also it's called the same title as the book, Guardians of the Dragon Path album. It's a double album of songs that were inspired at all of the sites that I visited. And along with that, we filmed videos at the sites. So it goes with 14 videos as well.
So do you sell that as a kind of separate package?
Yeah. It's listed in the back of the book. And so it tells about what it is. And there's a handy little QR code that people can use to connect. So yeah, it was an amazing project because, filming at these sites was an extra quest, and we were doing it right before the publishing of the book. So it was, running up these mountains and being out of breath, trying to talk about the Magdalene Church and always taking my harp. And one of the sites that we did a lot of the videos at, we did one for the Great Dolmen of Coberteia, the covered cross dolmen. And we did a couple at Empúries. Empúries was a center of Greek culture and then later Roman. So we had Asclepian healing temples, Isis temple, Serapis temple, and all along the coast also Artemis temples. But we did a lot of filming right around Empúries because it's on this beautiful rocky coast of the Mediterranean with the temple ruins behind, and it's very romantic.
Well, we're almost out of time now, but tell me, so where are you going next? What's the next part of this adventure?
I'm very excited. So I just finished an 8-day quest to the north I mentioned it briefly, the Mediolanum or Middle Earth. And I'm working with an astrophysicist in England who is able to find patterns in the landscape with a computer program. And it's not random. He was able to find 2 7-pointed stars in the landscape of Mediolanum, Middle Earth, geographical center. So we're working with a cross again, geographical center of France, where the Celts had their center and the Druids. So 2 7-pointed stars, 2 5-pointed stars, and a hexagram. So I went to those points, went to as many points as I could. I reached quite a few of them. with my music, with this idea of honoring the sites. Each of the points was a medieval chapel or sometimes a dolmen. So that's going in book 2.
Anie Williams, what a life you lead. Thank you for joining us today. Can I come along and carry your bags?
That would be great, Sandy.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's an amazing book. It really is. It's, it's not something you can just sit down and read. You've got to really, really savor this book. Let it all, churn around. So, Guardians of the Dragon Path. It is a trilogy, and I don't know when the second one will be out, but, got to read the first one first, and that's going to take some time. If you want more information about Anie's work, then you can visit her website, aniewilliams.com, ANI Williams.com, and you can learn about her CDs, her bioacoustic medicine practice, voice spectrum analysis, but give yourself some time because there's some wonderful blog posts there, and if you start reading those, you won't come out for a few hours.
A few weeks.
I'm Sandy Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of What Is Going On. Until then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Anie Williams.
Thank you, Sandy.